Sonny had been relying on Army Command to keep him alive for about half a year now, but weirdly enough, he had never been to the actual headquarters of the evacuation army. To be fair, Army Command had no definite location. It was spread across many siege capitals, strongholds, and even continents, all of them connected into a seamless network, both by technology and the aspect abilities of the awakened officers. Most of the staff was here in Antarctica, like the members of the department where Kim was currently working. But not all of them. That said, the underground fortress below the building where the reception hall was located seemed like the closest thing to the heart of Army Command. It was a hive of activity, with countless people both mundane and awakened, hurrying feverishly to accomplish a myriad of tasks promptly. Their work might not have seemed as dire as what the soldiers on the front lines were going through, but it was nevertheless just as vital. Without efficient and timely support and management, the evacuation campaign would be doomed to end in a bloody disaster. From updating the status of various areas about the strength of the call in them, to compiling data about countless nightmare creatures and guiding troop movements, Army Command was the brain of the army. Without the brain, the body would be utterly useless. Somewhere in here, there was also an office where the allocation of contribution points was decided. In any other circumstances, Sonny would have felt his heart start to beat faster, but right now, he was fully concentrating on something else. His eyes were glued to the bleak man who was walking behind Beastmaster and Shan, while acting perfectly unassuming, or at least as unassuming as a master could be. Army Command was, indeed, absolutely vital to the war effort. It was also a treasure trove of access and information. It would certainly be a shame if a particular psychopath got loose in its very heart. But what can I do? Sonny might have known who Mordred was and what he was capable of, but as far as stopping the Prince of Nothing went, there was little to be done, which was both unnerving and incredibly frustrating. Luckily, Sonny was not alone in his frustration. Morgan and Maddock also threw somber glances at the unassuming master from time to time, their eyes cold and sharp. Skytide had a complicated expression on her usually stoic face as well. Only Nethys seemed to be unconcerned. And why would she be? Of the five of them, she was the only one who had never met the Prince of Nothing. She would learn to be wary of him soon, though. Probably. In truth, their goals were closely aligned. There was no telling what Changing Star would do if she met Mordred face to face. Actually, the same went for Sonny. Despite his wariness and hostility, the Prince of Nothing was not necessarily his enemy. It was just that Sonny knew how inhumanly ruthless and blood-chillingly cruel Mordred could be, if it suited his goals, and how cunning he was. That was why Sonny could not remain calm at the prospect of someone like that going on a rampage across Antarctica. Would Mordred care how many innocent people burned in the flames of his retribution? Most definitely not. But what can I do? The same question returned, gnawing at Sonny. There were many things he could do, actually, just not any that would not end in him being killed on the spot by a wake of ruin or Beastmaster. He could prematurely start a direct clash between Song and Valor, right here in the army headquarters even. First of all, calm down. You don't even know if that is Mordred. The guy might be a random master the emissaries of Song chose to bring along for whatever reason. Sonny could see the soul cores of humans and nightmare creatures, but that ability was useless against the Prince of Nothing. When Mordred possessed a body, he also possessed the soul, or at least enough of it to mimic how it was supposed to look. Right. I shouldn't rush to conclusions. Wait for now. Observe. Act later. Saint Cor led them to a large chamber that was filled with all kinds of equipment to display information, much of it being updated in real time. Sonny looked curiously at a large projected map of East Antarctica, with countless symbols denoting masses of nightmare creatures moving across it in a seemingly chaotic manner. There were also numerous static marks, showcasing the location of nightmare gates. He paled slightly, suddenly faced with a stark reminder. of how many of them there were. The marks littered the entire map like pustules, as if the continent was being slowly devoured from the inside by a lethal disease. There was a staggering amount of them in the wilderness, but the concentration grew exponentially in the vicinity of the siege capitals. The moving symbols were all congregating toward the human settlements, too. The paths of the hordes of nightmare creatures might have seemed aimless at first, but if one looked at the bigger picture, it was painfully clear that all of them were slowly drawing closer to the 27 cities. It looked like an inescapable avalanche of death and despair. A nightmarish chain of doom and destruction was tied around Antarctica's neck, its cold embrace becoming tighter with each day. That was what the evacuation army was facing. Feeling a chill creep up his spine, Sonny lingered for a few moments and then glanced at the people walking in front of him. His eyes grew darker, and the shadows nestling in the corners of the strategy room grew deeper too. His hands would have turned into fists if he had not made a conscious effort to appear calm. His heart, however, was dark and heavy. Unforgivable. Even knowing what was happening in Antarctica, these mighty people had come here to make it all worse. Sonny thought back to what Wake of Ruin had said about the comparative benevolence of the great clans, trying to remember the crumbs of sense he had found in those words. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't. In a sense, it was no different from the outskirts. The whole world was like that. No one cared if you lived or died in the outskirts, and the people who had the power to help you all chose to do nothing, or at least as little as possible. In the same way, the people who held true power were comfortable doing nothing to save the population of Antarctica. The chain of nightmares had happened in the southern quadrant, but the next time, it might happen somewhere else. Then, too, they would remain indifferent. To those who lived in the outskirts, citizens seemed like people who inhabited a distant paradise, but to the great clans, the citizens were no different from the outskirt rats. Of course, one could object and argue for the other side. The government was not malicious at its core, and its treatment of the people in the outskirts was born out of necessity. The outskirts existed because the planet could not sustain the whole human population. Someone had to be sacrificed to make sure that the rest survived. Otherwise, there would not be enough resources to save anyone, and it wasn't like the unfortunate souls in the outskirts were completely abandoned. There was a constant supply of cheap synth paste. There were jobs. There was electricity, access to entertainment, and so much more. People were not being left to die. They at least had the means to survive, if only barely. It was just that their lives were more or less doomed to be short and bitterly hard. In the same way, the great clans were not entirely heartless. It was just that their plans for humanity were aimed at the dream realm and not the waking world. Even then, they made a little bit of effort. They had sent Skytide and Direfang. The House of Night might not have taken part in the ground operation, but they did supply enough saints and nightwalkers to guide the naval convoys to and from Antarctica. But still, Sonny could not forgive them. He didn't want to. All of it was a load of crap as far as he was concerned. He might have found a way to excuse the great clans if remaining passive was all that they had done, but they did not stop at that. Not only had Valor and Song abandoned Antarctica to the Chain of Nightmares, but they even planned to use it as a private battlefield and fight each other while countless people suffered and died around them. That he could not forgive. Sonny glanced at the back of the bleak man and smiled slightly. You want to slaughter the entire clan, Valor? Wonderful. Slaughter them well. Then he looked at Nephis. You want to destroy all of them? Even better. I'll cheer you on. Sonny was not a forgiving man. In fact, he was quite spiteful. Let's see how their little war goes. The strategy meeting dragged on. The emissaries of the great clan seemed to be well aware of the situation on the infected continent. In fact, they seemed to have a clearer picture of what was going on than even Sonny did. But their understanding of the nuances of the Antarctica campaign was purely theoretical in nature. Only Skytide and Direfang possessed practical knowledge of what it meant to fight against the land that was slowly being devoured by a tide of nightmares. The others were going to have to catch up fast. Still, they were not inexperienced people. Whispering Blade, especially, was a veteran of many wars. He had led the Knights of Valor into plenty of untamed regions of the Dream Realm, spending years in lengthy and harrowing campaigns of subjugation to expand the borders of human territory in that inhospitable world. It was easy to understand why Anvil had chosen his brother to helm the conquest of the Tomb of Ariel. Beastmaster was at least a decade younger than Saint Matic, but she seemed no less of a seasoned tactician. From that perspective, her exalted reputation had not appeared out of nowhere after all. The lands controlled by the Song clan might not have expanded as dramatically as those ruled by Valor in the past 2 decades, but every region they did conquer had been a much more dire hell to surmount. The tantalizing saint was surprisingly soft-spoken and cordial. Sunny had expected her to be arrogant, aloof, and unapproachable, but she was actually quite easygoing. Her husky voice was pleasant on the ear, and her red lips were quick to twist into a small but bright smile. That smile was absolutely beguiling. Shan was not that much younger than Beastmaster. Even though she was not a saint, she had spent more time braving the horrors of the Dream Realm than most transcendents. A decade of surviving on the Forgotten Shore made her more than qualified to participate in this meeting. The same went for Nephis. She might not have remained there as long, but her singular achievement of surviving close to 2 years of solitude in one of the most dire regions of the Dream Realm, eventually escaping it through a nightmare seed, earned her some respect from everyone present in the strategy room. As for Morgan, no one except for Matic knew much about her achievements and experiences, but they also did not doubt her competence. Her mind was as sharp as her eyes, and her knowledge of warfare and strategy seemed almost supernatural. The blood of War God flowed through her veins after all. Sunny wouldn't be surprised if the Princess of Valor ended up being the most talented strategist among them. So each of them was more than capable of absorbing new information about the perils and nuances of the Chain of Nightmares at a staggering speed. Except for the unassuming Bleak Man, who had been introduced as Ascended Bast. Even his name was dull and unmemorable. From what had been told about him, Ascended Bast was simply a retainer of the great clan's song. He was a part of their advanced party because of a rare and useful utility aspect. No one bought that explanation, though. Sunny and Jet had been relegated to the role of silent observers, but even they spoke up from time to time, answering questions or sharing their personal experiences of fighting on the front line. Bast, however, had not said a single word from the start of the meeting, remaining placidly in a corner and watching the proceedings with relaxed, aloof calmness. Like a cat playing with a mouse. Sunny had never seen a cat, but he had met a few rats on the outskirts. As far as vermin went, rats were pretty scary, so a creature that made a hobby out of hunting and torturing them must have been terrifying. Still, there was a limit to how much he could stare at the Bleak Master. The discussion Wake of Ruin was having with the emissaries of the great clans was not that interesting either. Sure, many important things were being talked about, but Sunny knew most of them. The rest he could absorb by allocating a small part of his mind to the task, which was only made easier by the blessing of mind. Eventually, his eyes settled on Nephis. Sunny lingered for a while, then asked her through the mental link, "What are you planning to do?" He knew what the great clans wanted. He knew what the government wanted. He knew what the nightmare creatures wanted, and he even somewhat knew what he wanted. Changing Star, however, was a mystery. Her endgame was absolutely clear, but here and now, Sunny was not sure what Nephis wanted to get out of Antarctica. Then seemingly turned her attention back to the discussion of which force would be responsible for which area of East Antarctica. Her response came a few moments later and was very simple. "Survive." Sunny tilted his head a little. "Quite a sober answer coming from you. Where is the real Nephis and what have you done to her?" The corner of her mouth twitched upward. That small change was so subtle that he doubted anyone except for him noticed it. Neff lingered for a while. Eventually she spoke, or rather thought, in her usual even tone. "Sonny, don't you think that life is pretty strange?" Sonny blinked. What has gotten into her? He wasn't used to hearing such questions from Neffis. "Yeah, sure. Why?" She maintained her poised appearance, pretending to pay attention to the conversation about the disposition of clan forces, as she answered, "You've been through a lot in these past 6 months. The time before that must seem like a lifetime ago for you. But for me, when I wake up, I still think that I am in the nightmare sometimes. For me, it feels like I was lost in the dream realm just yesterday." Changing Star paused, then continued after a few short moments. "But I am not. I am a member of Clan Valor now. I have a citadel of my own, and dozens of Awakened are ready to follow my orders. That was yesterday. Today, I am in the Southern Quadrant, preparing to wage war, both on countless nightmare creatures and on the best of Clan Song. Beastmaster is here, smiling at me politely. Whispering Blade is also here, watching my every move. All of it is a bit overwhelming." She turned her head and looked at him, her clear gray eyes looking a little burdened. "So, I plan to take it one step at a time, one little step after another, until all my enemies are dead. And that is why my first step is to survive." Neffis shook her head, then looked back to the map of East Antarctica, which was currently being carved between Valor, Song, and the government. A few moments later, her voice resounded in his head once again, this time tinged with a hint of amusement. Neffis shook her head. "Why do you think that surviving this mayhem will be easy? It won't." Sonny was a bit thoughtful for the rest of the long strategy meeting. Indeed, it wasn't going to be easy to survive the mad maelstrom that was brewing in Antarctica. He was strong and cunning, but in front of monsters like Whispering Blade and Beastmaster, all that strength could end up meaning nothing. Even the 2 tyrannical saints were not guaranteed safety. When people like that had to be careful not to lose their lives, someone like Sonny or Neffis could only pray to the cold skies. Sadly, the gods were dead, so their prayers were doomed to remain unanswered, so they had to ensure their survival. Luckily, if there was one thing Sonny excelled at, it was staying alive. "And biding my time," he thought. A legion of nightmare creatures on one side, 2 murderous armies of the great clans on the other, with Mordred hiding somewhere in the reflections, waiting to strike. It was time for Sonny to show what he was made of, and hope that it was enough. No, he had to make it so that what he could do was enough, and if it wasn't, he had to change himself in a way that would. "But my task is not as ambitious as what these legacies have to accomplish." That was perhaps the only saving grace in this grim situation. Valor and Song wanted to crush the enemy and conquer the Black Pyramid. Neffis simply wanted to survive and earn the trust of her enemies by being a good soldier, and maybe a little more than that. As for Sonny, he simply wanted to make sure that their war did not spill out into the streets of the siege capitals, and that as few soldiers and civilians as possible were hurt by the clash of the great clans. And if he managed to hurt the bastards in the process, that would be even better. Still, it was not an easy thing to accomplish. He listened to the discussion of strategy and thinking. The whole meeting was both fruitful and ridiculous. The representatives of the great clans knew very well that they were going to be killing each other soon. However, they maintained an illusion of camaraderie, pretending to take the issues of the evacuation campaign seriously. They had to keep up appearances after all. That was possibly the most important advantage Sonny had. Other than that, the broad strokes of what the near future would look like had been decided quickly. Officially, Everyone would work together to resist the chain of nightmares and make sure that the evacuation proceeded smoothly, with every human in the southern quadrant leaving the cursed continent eventually. The territory of East Antarctica would be divided into 3 regions. The first one was going to remain in the purview of the government, with the 2 legacy saints that had been participating in the campaign from the start continuing to assist Wake of Ruin in resisting the tide of abominations. Reading between the lines, that meant that Skytide and Direfang were going to remain on the sidelines for most of the clash. The main job of these 2, at least for now, was to keep an eye on each other and make sure that the opponent could not be of assistance to the enemy side. The other 2 regions would still be protected by the evacuation army, but for all intents and purposes, the expedition forces of the great clans would be in charge. They were supposed to keep the siege capitals safe and hunt down especially powerful nightmare creatures. If one of the titans moved toward a human city, all saints were supposed to join forces and eradicate it. Of course, Wake of Ruin would not stop Whispering Blade and Beastmaster from trying to take down the titans in the wilderness. Before that even happened, what it meant was that the government was washing its hands and giving the great clans carte blanche to kill each other as much as they wanted, as long as it was done outside the walls of the siege capitals. The true goal of valor and song was out there somewhere, in the wild reaches of Antarctica after all. What they wanted was to find a nightmare gate that would allow them to safely ferry their forces into the Dream Realm, and eventually establish a stronghold that would serve as a staging ground for the conquest of the tomb of Ariel. They also needed to make sure that the enemy wouldn't get to the Citadel first, and the easiest way to accomplish that was to destroy the enemy. There were more complications as well, but it wasn't that simple. For example, both Valor and Song announced a startling intention to permanently close as many gates that had appeared within the limits of the siege capitals as they could. The hundreds of Awakened that each great clan had sent to Antarctica were almost all meant to challenge the seeds of Nightmare. Certainly their true purpose was to send as many soldiers into the hellish desert as possible, to scout it out and find a good entry point for the main force. But even if the scouts having to enter their second nightmares was just a side effect, that decision could forever change the balance of power among the Awakened. There were not that many masters in the world, and their number was already starting to swell because of the chain of nightmares. The Awakened Song and Valor had were all absolute elites. If dozens, or maybe even 100 or 2 of them ascended, it would have an explosive effect on everything. But that was not what Sunny was concerned about. What worried him was the prospect of these scouts finding a great entry point behind one of the nightmare gates located inside the siege capitals, and not in the wilderness. If that happened, all hell could break loose. But a crossing to a spot that would serve as the key to reaching the Black Pyramid, nothing would stop the other party from making sure that the siege capital in question changed hands. They would much rather see it destroyed even than remain under the control of the enemy. There will be 3 stages to this disaster. First, the clans will scout for a good entrance to the desert. Second, they will enter the Dream Realm through that entrance and launch an expedition toward the tomb of Ariel. Lastly, they will build strongholds in the vicinity of the pyramid, gather their forces, and launch their final attacks. The first stage would probably mostly consist of covert ambushes and small-scale skirmishes between the forces of Valor and Song. The second stage would be where the true bloodshed started, and the last would be pure hell. Sunny was now clear on the overall shape of the clan war, but he still had a lot of questions. He lacked information on what exactly they were going to do, when, and how. So, just as Nephis had said, he was going to take it one step at a time. The first step he had to take was to gather information. Sitting silently at the back of the meeting room, Sunny glanced at the people who were gathered there, the high and mighty saints of legendary renown, and smiled a little. Would you look at that? After all these years, it seems that I am finally going to get a chance to act as a proper spy. Spying on the saints of the great clans sounded like an interesting method of killing himself, but Sonny was willing to try. His aspect was tailor-made for stealth and infiltration, after all. It was just that he had not used that side of its powers as often as he would have wished to. Sonny could not say that he was truly a master of stealth, but he was also not an amateur. He had relied on staying hidden a lot throughout the years of being an Awakened, from the ruined streets of the Dark City to the airy expanse of the Chained Isles and the cold hellscape of East Antarctica. In these past 2 months, especially, he had tried to remain unseen as often as possible. The duties of a military scout demanded it, and through that necessity, Sonny had been able to develop his mastery of all things clandestine a notch further. A person could only rely on stealth that much, though. The most dire conflicts he tended to find himself in were almost all direct, violent confrontations. Still, it was an exceptionally useful ability to have, and now Sonny needed to exercise it to its fullest extent. He had been thinking about how exactly to approach that task for a long time now, and the conclusion was that he needed to be in several places at the same time to achieve the best result. Thankfully, he was capable of doing just that, to a degree. Sonny had 5 shadows now, and the range at which he could control them was quite large, exceeding 20 kilometers, which meant that he could keep an eye on representatives of both valor and song, at least for the next few days. Once they departed for different siege capitals, he would be forced to concentrate on only the former. So, Sonny left himself with 1 shadow, otherwise he would look conspicuous, and sent the other 4 to spy on the champions of the great clans. The naughty shadow, as the new guy, remained glued to his feet. The haughty shadow was following Morgan. The happy shadow was following Matic. The gloomy shadow had been sent to spy on Beastmaster. And lastly, the creepy shadow was assigned to Ascended Bast, the man whom Sonny suspected to be possessed by Mordred. Keeping track of what all of them saw and heard put a bit of a strain on his mind, but mostly Sonny could manage the pressure. Although it was hard not to appear absent-minded and clumsy in his personal interactions, considering that Sonny was in charge of managing a lot of logistical tasks as the middleman between the forces of Valor and the government, that was proving to be a challenge. But the hardest part, of course, was not being caught by the people he was trying to spy on. Sonny was not nearly naive enough to think that the glorious great clans had no means of detecting his shadows, even if his aspect made them nearly imperceptible when hidden in darkness, or even absolutely imperceptible for mundane humans. There were all kinds of memories and exotic aspects out there. For example, the first time he had met Noctis, the sorcerer was instantly aware of the presence of a hidden shadow, and that was without even knowing who Sonny was. The great clans, on the contrary, were well aware of his capabilities. They might not have known the exact details of his aspect, but they certainly knew of his affinity to shadows, as well as the general shape of what he was capable of. Shadow users were rare, but not so rare as to be unfamiliar to the domains. Shadowblade Kurt had belonged to one of them after all. Therefore, it only made sense that the great clans would have countermeasures prepared, just in case. Sonny's goal was to overcome these countermeasures, or at least pierce through as many of them as he could and identify all the rest to stay away from them. What helped him a lot in that task, surprisingly, was the experience of serving as a military scout. He had learned the basics of the necessary skills from Effie and the Dark City, as well as his own travels, and now developed them even further in the wilderness of East Antarctica. Powerful nightmare creatures, much like powerful Awakened, had all kinds of strange abilities. So the scouts had to learn a few strange rules, and a lot of odd tricks, to remain unseen by them. For example, many creatures could feel a gaze directed at them, so Sonny had learned to never look straight at dangerous abominations, instead keeping them on the periphery of his vision. Other creatures could feel if someone was thinking about them, or hear if someone spoke their names aloud. So Sonny had to learn how to keep his mind empty and choose his words and thoughts carefully. There were a lot of tricks like that, But most importantly, one simply had to be smart and careful about it. That was why, no matter how much he wanted to just go all out and listen to every word his mark said, Sonny took things slowly. He kept his shadows at a safe distance at first, gradually getting closer and closer to the four legacies. There was also a difference between how they acted in normal circumstances and how they acted when something important had to be discussed. The former was easier, while the latter could be nearly impossible to overhear. Even legacy sleepers like Castor possessed memories that could make it hard for anyone to listen in on important conversations. Back in the Dark City, he had used one to create a cone of silence around the room where they talked. Someone like Morgan or Beastmaster, without a doubt, would have much more potent tools to prevent anyone from learning their secrets. Sonny almost got caught a few times because of these measures. For example, both Valor and Song used special memories to create bubbles of evenly diffused bright light while having meetings. Since the source of light was omnidirectional and its brightness was perfectly the same, no shadow could exist within the bubble. A fact that he had learned the hard way, only avoiding a disaster thanks to his paranoia and caution. And still, despite it all, Sonny managed to get closer and closer to Whispering Blade, Beastmaster, Morgan, and Bast. Although he was not able to infiltrate the most important meeting, he was still able to learn a lot and piece together even more from small and seemingly unconnected pieces of information they let slip out. He might not have managed to learn their most guarded secrets yet, but he did learn a few interesting things. Sonny was mostly interested in the details of what each of the two feuding clans had prepared for Antarctica, but those plans were tightly guarded by those who had been entrusted with them. He suspected that learning the specifics of their strategy would become easier when the main forces of Valor and Song arrived in Antarctica. The more people involved in something, the harder it was to keep things secret. However, for now, only a handful of emissaries were here, all busy with rather transparent preparatory work. That did not mean that he had failed to learn anything of use, of course. Knowing the enemy's next move was immensely valuable, but knowing the enemy was much more important. By observing his four marks, Sonny was slowly becoming familiar with how they acted, felt, and even thought. When Beastmaster was standing on the city wall observing a horde of nightmare creatures assaulting it with an eerily serene expression on her exquisitely beautiful face, Sonny's shadow was there, watching. When Whispering Blade stopped to look at the mundane soldiers, a hint of detached pity finding its way into his calm eyes, Sonny's shadow was there, watching. When Morgan practiced her swordsmanship, moving with grace and speed that would make the most famed warriors feel heavy in their hearts, Sonny's shadow was there, watching. And when the bleak, unassuming ascended Bast spent hours doing nothing, sitting like a corpse in a dark room, Sonny's shadow was there as well. Of course, the small nuances of their personalities were not everything that Sonny learned. He gained a much better understanding of their abilities as well. Beastmaster was indeed a frightening being. Her powers lay in mesmerism and manipulation. From what he could tell, simply looking her in the eyes could be a death sentence. She could make her enemies defenseless by luring them into a state of deep trance, or bedevil them with insidious illusions. And above all else, she could completely dominate someone's mind, making them an eternal thrall. Whispering Blade was just as fearsome. Even though his powers were not as fiendish, they were just as deadly. His quintessential ability was to make all weapons he wielded invisible. And his Saint transformation was to be unseen as well. Since Saint Matic was not nearly as mysterious and secretive as his counterpart from the Song clan, it was widely known that when he fought, it was as though the world itself was slicing the bodies of his enemies apart. There was no escape. Morgan, on the other hand, had a rather strange aspect. If Whispering Blade possessed an ability that made the sword he wielded deadlier, then Morgan was the blade itself. The feeling of sharpness she emanated was not a coincidence. The Princess of War did not need any weapons, because her body was the absolute weapon. She could cut through armored alloy and the flesh of even the most powerful nightmare creatures with her hands, and rend their bodies with her feet. It was both strange and terrifying, as though she was not a human, but a living sword. In retrospect, it made a lot of sense that she had easily cut through the adamantine breastplate of the mantle of the underworld with her bare hand.
Wouldn't it mean that she cheated? She promised to only use a dormant weapon.
That thought, strangely, led Sonny to discover a hint of what Morgan's flaw was. While observing her, he noticed that Morgan preferred clothes that revealed as little of her skin and body as possible. She even wore gloves, never appearing without them. Sometimes it was the gauntlets of her armor, and sometimes it was the slim, stylish leather gloves that went well with her tailored, mundane clothes. Because of that, Sonny started to suspect that the Princess of Valor was not in control of what her hands cut, or rather, that everything she touched was doomed to be sliced and severed as if carved by a sharp blade. Perhaps the flaw was not as powerful as her ability, otherwise her armor would not be able to withstand it, but it was certainly a cruel extension of it. Sadly, Sonny had no such luck in deducing the flaws of Whispering Blade and Beastmaster. And then there was Bat. Sonny had not learned anything about him at all. The bleak man was like a corpse that someone was wearing as a suit. He was quiet, dull, and devoid of much emotion. He never did much of anything, but was nevertheless treated with strange courtesy, deference even, by Shan, Beastmaster, and Dire Fang. Bast did nothing, just waiting and biding his time. But Sonny could swear that there was a menacing malevolence hiding behind the placid dullness of his eyes.
Doing, bastard? What are your reflections doing? When are you going to strike?
Sonny was not the only one who paid close attention to Bast. Even though they did not show it, Morgan and Matic were tracking the movements of the Bleak Master as well. He learned a few things about Mordred from the fragments of their conversations about the man. For example, he learned that Anvil had personally crafted the enchanted talisman that protected Ascended Welty from being possessed by her ward. He also learned Anvil's title, the King of Swords. The King of Swords had prepared a few more tools to trap and destroy his eldest child. However, both Whispering Blade and Morgan were hesitant to use them yet. They were unnerved by Bast's inaction too. Just like that, a few days passed. Sonny had been gathering information like a spider sitting in the middle of a vast web. He had not made any earth-shattering discoveries in that short time, but it was a good start. In truth, he was more concentrated on finding safe ways to get closer to his marks for now than on actually stealing their secrets. Once he truly learned how to slither through their defenses, the secrets would be revealed as a result. On the fourth day, it was time to say his goodbyes to Jet. Both Song and Valor were leaving the siege capitals to travel to the respective port fortresses and meet the arriving reinforcements. After that, they would proceed to outer cities, and the clandestine war would start in earnest. Sonny was leaving with the emissaries of Valor, and Jet was leaving with the emissaries of Song. Chances were, they would not meet face to face for a long time. He would have been worried if it was anyone else. But there was little doubt that Soul Reaper would be able to keep herself alive. He had already warned her to steer clear of the man who called himself Bast, just to be safe. The person Sonny had to worry about was himself.
I'll survive too.
But that was the thing. Simply surviving was not enough. It had not been for a long time, and that was what could get him killed. With a sigh, Sonny called back the shadows that had been watching the emissaries of Song and went to find Nephis. It was time for the two of them to travel side by side once again. On a vast plain peppered with twisting streams and shallow lakes, A cataclysmic battle was taking place. Legions of nightmare creatures were flowing across it like a dark tide, with several titanic figures marching among them. The ground shook with each of their steps, and the skies above were obscured by a whirlwind of hungry crows. Humans fought against the abominations in the shadow of their wings. Today, the forces of humanity gathered from all across Antarctica to stop the march of the titanic horde. 7 saints led them into battle. There was Wake of Ruin, the Carrion Crow, a legendary figure who had been protecting the waking world since the times of the first generation. Whispering Blade, the first blade of the great clan Valor, who had led countless awakened warriors in the conquest of the Dream Realm. There was Beastmaster, a fearsome and enchanting daughter of the great clan Song, and her sister, Silent Stalker, who was a huntress and a slayer of Thing. There was also Skytide of the Whitefeather clan, and Dire Fang, a bestial warrior of incomparable savagery and strength. There were close to 100 masters on the battlefield as well, serving as champions and officers of the human army. Sunny was one of these masters. As he watched the inconceivable scene of the clash between two mighty forces, awed by its scale and ferocity, there was only one thought in his mind.
Holy hell!
He had seen a lot of incredible things in his life, but all, with the exception of the Visage of Hope, paled in comparison to this calamitous confrontation. It was, without a doubt, the largest battle that had happened since the start of the Antarctica campaign, and maybe even in the history of this world. Sunny was currently high above the battlefield in what served as the command center for the joined army of the government and the great clans. The command center was situated in a stone fort that stood on top of the carapace of a giant, monstrous tortoise, which was one of Morgan's echoes. Luckily, the Princess of Valor, the Princess of War, had not summoned it on the day of her arrival. Otherwise, the giant beast would have flattened the entire government building. It was like a moving fortress. Morgan herself was nearby, commanding the army. The Saints were busy fighting the Titans that led the horde, so they had no time to play the role of detached strategist. The Princess of War, on the other hand, was a genius tactician. By now, no one put that fact in doubt despite her young age. Of course, Shan was also here, keeping an eye out so that Morgan did not get any funny ideas. So were Jet, Nephis, and Cassia. Changing Star and the Firekeepers were held in reserve for now, and would be sent out to close the gaps in the spot of the battlefield where the situation was most dire. As for Song of the Fallen, she had proven to be an invaluable resource in such situations. With her ascended ability allowing her to see through the eyes of soldiers throughout the battlefield, she could relay all necessary information to the commander in mere moments. With her help, Morgan's grasp of the situation was more fluid and immediate. Just at that moment, Cassia shifted a little, a subtle frown appearing on her delicate face.
A corrupted devil is getting close to the 7th Company of the Ursus Brigade. Its abilities are mental manipulation, inducing fear, and augmenting itself through consumption. The 3rd Company of the Lyra Brigade is sustaining heavy casualties because of the change in terrain caused by the burrower minions of the fallen tyrant. Designation: the Worm. The wolves have just reached the location of the worm.
Morgan lingered for a moment, then glanced at the blind young woman. Her vermilion eyes had been glinting vibrantly since the start of the battle.
You know Raised by Wolves personally, right? What is your estimation of how long it would take her to get rid of that tyrant?
Nephis answered instead, looking at a particular spot of the battlefield with a somber expression.
Around 3 minutes, give or take.
Morgan smiled.
Fast, but not fast enough. I will send out one of the echoes to speed things along.
She was ready to give the order, but stopped when Cassia suddenly spoke.
Don't. Send it to reinforce 3 Lyra instead.
Morgan glanced at her curiously.
Why?
The blind girl remained silent for a moment.
The Ascended in charge of the 3rd Lyra Company is the only one whose aspect directly counters the abilities of the corrupted demon. Designation: Frost Furnace. We must make sure that we preserve as much essence as possible for now. There is also a lake between the nearest echo and the position of the wolves. Traversing it will waste time."
The Princess of Valor smiled slightly.
"Correct. Good thinking."
With that, she continued to give orders, controlling the large army like the conductor of a giant cacophonous orchestra. Cassia continued to provide first-hand accounts of what was happening on the battlefield, and from time to time, poignant pieces of advice. Nephis remained silent, which was a bit strange, considering that she was no less knowledgeable about how to wage war on nightmare creatures. Nevertheless, Changing Star simply watched the havoc of the furious battle, her eyes heavy. Sunny was willing to bet that he knew what she was thinking about, because he was thinking the same thing. Today was their first time seeing all the saints of Antarctica go all out, and that was a priceless source of information, not the least because these mighty demigods would one day be Neph's opponents. The powers they showcased today would be turned against her in the future, and maybe against Sunny too.
Damn it. How scary.
Looking at the battlefield, he could feel a cold chill running down his spine. It was a rare privilege to get the chance to see exalted figures like Whispering Blade and Beastmaster fight, and yet Sunny did not feel consoled by their awesome powers. Instead, he felt resigned. Nevertheless, he couldn't look away. About a month had passed since the day Sunny was assigned to act as a government envoy for the forces of Valor. In that time, they had reached a distant port fortress, met up with the main contingent of the Great Clan, including Cassia, the Firekeepers, and the valiant Saint Summer Night, and traveled to the region that was supposed to be their zone of responsibility. However, almost as soon as they settled in one of the siege capitals there, Wake of Ruin requested the emissaries of both great clans to join forces against a tremendous horde of nightmare creatures that had formed around several titans. The emissaries had promised to join forces if the situation required it after all, and it certainly did. If the horde was not stopped, their plans were bound to suffer as well, so they reluctantly answered Saint Cor's summons and ventured into the wilderness to form a united army. Valor and Song were hell-bent on destroying each other, but that did not mean that they couldn't cooperate. Once faced with a common enemy, the champions of the two warring domains at least had the decency to not strike their opponents in the back, or at least they hadn't yet. Mordred was suspiciously absent from the battlefield, though. Who knew what Ascended Bast was doing right now? Sunny knew exactly what he was doing. Jet was doing him a favor by keeping an eye on the bleak man, so Sunny was well informed on Master Bast's movements. He was currently in a siege capital far to the west, establishing a supply chain for Song's expedition forces, which prowled the wilderness in search of suitable nightmare gates. Ascended Bast was also in charge of an industrial production facility. In that facility, he was making mirrors, thousands of them, for unknown reasons. Or at least he had been a few days ago. Currently, Jet was right here by Sunny's side, watching the battlefield with a hungry expression. For all they knew, the bleak man might have slaughtered the entire siege capital by now. Jet suddenly raised her head.
"There, look."
Everyone except for Cassia looked up. In the skies above them, a titanic clash was taking place. Myriads of crows were swirling like a black maelstrom. Two giant shapes were entangled in a murderous dance. One was a giant bird of prey with white feathers and talons forged out of lustrous steel. Her wings wreathed in lightning. The other was a scaled beast with 3 long necks and 3 terrifying maws, its enormous body held up in the air by vast skeletal wings. The scaled beast was littered with thousands of wounds from the swarm of crows assaulting it, but it did not seem bothered by their merciless attacks. Instead, a miasma of rot and corruption flowed from the numerous torn holes on its body, trailing behind the Titan and spreading through the sky like a cloud of pure, inescapable death. Saint Tyrus had been controlling the winds to blow the cloud away from the battlefield, but right at that moment, the crows suddenly dashed away from the winged horror. A split second later, It was encased in a cage of lightning, and then the white bird flew through the lightning to crash directly into the giant beast. Her talons tore at its chest, and her beak closed on one of its necks, ripping it to shreds. Sky Tide jerked her head violently and severed the neck of the Titan completely. As vile miasma billowed from the terrible wound like a fountain, the head of the creature plummeted down and crashed into the ground, obliterating several hundreds of nightmare creatures. Sonny clenched his fists, then looked away from the aerial battle. Breathtaking and terrifying things were happening on the ground as well. In one corner of the battlefield, a mountain of malformed flesh was crawling across the plain, absorbing everything in its path into itself. Those nightmare creatures that were unfortunate enough to approach it were instantly caught by fleshy tentacles, drawn into the body of the ghastly Titan, and consumed, becoming a part of it. If the mountain of flesh reached the dense line of the human army, the same fate awaited the soldiers. However, it did not get the chance. Long before the Titan drew close to the ranks of Awakened, a lone figure stepped forward from between them and then disappeared. Sonny saw the moment clearly, but even still, it seemed as though Whispering Blade had never been there at all. In the next moment, something both spectacular and terrifying happened. It was as though a wide, bloody path was carved through the horde of nightmare creatures by an invisible force. No one could see what was delivering the cuts, but countless abominations were instantly turned into minced meat. Not a swarm of unseen blades, a wave of them. The wave rolled through the horde, rending everything in its path, and soon reached the crawling mountain of flesh. Countless tentacles writhed, trying to catch whoever was attacking the Titan. However, all they caught was air. Meanwhile, bloody lacerations started to appear on the surface of the flesh mountain, sometimes several at a time, each dozens of meters in length and extremely deep. Tentacles were severed and sent flying away, only to crawl back like fleshy snakes. Despite suffering dire wounds, the Titan was not succumbing to the assault of invisible blades. Yet. But it had stopped completely, letting the soldiers sigh with relief. In another spot on the battlefield, a man in lustrous armor was wielding a lance that seemed to be made of clear water to cut through a sea of gray vines that grew from the ground with terrifying speed. The brooks, rivers, and lakes around him seemed to have turned into weapons as well. Streams of water rose from them and flew through the air like whips, cleanly slicing through the vines and washing them away. The summer night remained calm as he faced the wrath of the unseen Titan. He welcomed its attention because it lessened the pressure on two different saints. Deep in the area completely consumed by gray vines, a creature that resembled a towering monstrous mix between a human and a wolf was clawing at the ground, digging into it with vicious purpose. With each movement, countless vines were torn apart. The giant fiend, Saint Direfang, was being assaulted by the vines from all sides. Most were cut down by Summer Night, and those that were not ended up being obliterated by heavy arrows that flew from the fringes of the battlefield where Silent Stalker moved, unseen. And finally, there was the last Titan, a ghostly figure surrounded by shimmering haze, which moved across the battlefield like a mirage. Wherever it passed, reality itself seemed to twist and come undone, revealing indescribable horrors. The nightmare creatures who gazed at the mirages grew still and silent, then moved again. Or rather, their bodies moved, as if warned by something not quite familiar with what flesh was, and how beings made of flesh were supposed to carry themselves through space. No Awakened barred their path, and neither did any saint. However, the abominations did. First a few, then a dozen, then 100, and finally an avalanche of them threw themselves into the shimmering haze, trying to disperse it. Each of them had clawed their eyes out before attacking, driven mad by a strange and overwhelming desire to destroy the ghostly titan at any cost. The nightmare creatures who had been possessed by the haze were torn apart by other abominations as well. It was as if Beastmaster was laughing at the harrowing creature. You can possess the bodies of living beings? So what? I can take their minds, their hearts, and their very souls. Sunny stared, feeling both stirred and grim. Would he hold such power one day? If he did, he would be laughing too. The Seven Saints were battling the Titans. The echoes of their dreadful clash spread like shockwaves through the horde of nightmare creatures. Somewhere far away, a vestige of the horde suddenly surged and swirled, lunging at something unseen. A moment later, a bloody haze veiled that entire section of the battlefield from view, and the wind carried over howls of agony, which all fell silent soon. Silent Stalker was prowling there, slaughtering the abominations and never failing to send her arrows to support Dire Fang and Summer Night. The latter had yet to assume his transcendent form as well. Beastmaster and Whispering Blade were each holding back a titan of their own, and Skytide had just succeeded in delivering a debilitating wound to the great-scaled beast, dispersing the cloud of deadly miasma created by the flying horror at the same time. All in all, things weren't looking bad, which was not to say that the battle was going smoothly. Far from it. The titanic horde did not just consist of the 4 titans, and it was the task of Awakened and Ascended to face the vast legion of abominations. While not as spectacular, that task was just as important. Sunny watched the battle grow more and more fierce. All the while, Cassia continued to keep them informed of the more important changes happening on the battlefield. Her voice was calm and composed.
The fallen tyrant, designation Worm, has been slain. 3rd Company of the Lyra Brigade is advancing to support the 5th. The corrupted demon, designation Frost Furnace, has been slain. Ascended Yu Jin of the 1st Company of the Cassiopeia Brigade has fallen. The corrupted devil, designation Hexblade, has been slain by Ascended Nightingale. It would be prudent to temporarily withdraw the Night Singers from the Flashpoint Delta.
At first, the good news was mixed with the bad news in equal measure. Morgan continued to react to the changes on the battlefield, moving her many pieces around to present an almost flawless defense against the onslaught of nightmare creatures. The battle formation created by her was fluid and flexible, bending when needed and lashing out with tremendous force at other times. In fact, it seemed that Cassia and her were not just reacting, but actually anticipating many of the changes on the chaotic battlefield. It was a lot like personal combat. Being able to anticipate what move the enemy would make was half the victory. The other half was using that knowledge to deliver a fatal strike. Sadly, there was a limit to what Morgan could do. No matter how good she was, the enemy facing them was just too dreadful. The Princess of War remained calm, but her face was slowly growing grim. As time went on, Cassia's reports began to sound more and more dire.
7th Company of the Ursus Brigade is routed. 1st Company of the Cassiopeia Brigade is suffering heavy casualties. Ascended Ripple of the 7 Ursus has fallen. 1st Company of the Cassiopeia Brigade is routed. Defensive line is breached. Wolves and Night Singers are advancing to seal the breach. I don't think they'll be able to hold out.
Morgan remained silent for a few moments, then nodded slowly.
Yes, that is troublesome.
Sunny stared at her slightly. To use the word troublesome was the understatement of the century. With both layers of the defensive line breached, the nightmare creatures would be free to pour through and attack the formation from the rear. Once they did, one company after another would collapse, causing a fatal cascade. Some forces could be pulled back from other places on the battlefield to plug the breach, but they needed time to reach it. Morgan glanced at Nephis and suddenly smiled.
How about it, dear sister? Are you ready to solve that problem for me?
Neph looked at the battlefield, then turned her head slightly and nodded.
It is the reason why you have held me in reserve, is it not?
Morgan laughed.
Indeed. Take your firekeepers and go. Then show these abominations what a daughter of valor is capable of.
Changing Star simply turned away, ready to jump down from the stone fort onto the carapace of the giant tortoise. However, at that moment, Sunny finally spoke.
Can I go too?
Morgan, and Shan as well, gave him surprised glances. After a short moment, the Princess of War asked,
Really? But you don't have to, Master Sunless. As a government envoy, your duties are simply to serve as a messenger between us and your army command. It would be very embarrassing for me if the envoy entrusted to Clan Valor went and died.
Sunny frowned.
Really? It would be very embarrassing for me, too, so I'll make sure to stay alive.
Morgan smiled. It seemed that there was some approval in her smile. She gave him a nod.
Well, in that case, by all means, you were designated as a special strategic asset after all. I imagine that you could handle yourself on the battlefield.
After that, she gave Shan a short glance, as if mocking the heiress of song for having a less capable government spy assigned to her. Jet stretched her arms, looking down with a hungry glint in her eyes.
Then I'll join too. Watching all this slaughter got me riled up.
She seemed very comfortable playing into her reputation as a psychotic killer. Neither Morgan nor Shan said anything, at least. Without delaying any further, Nephis, Sunny, and Jet jumped down to the carapace of the giant Echo, then slid off its side and landed on the ground near where the firekeepers were waiting, ready to do battle. Noticing them, the survivors of the Dark City broke out in smiles.
Lady Nephis, are you deploying? Finally!
Hey, Sunny, where's your armor? Hurry up and summon it. Oh man, Sunny is with us? Effie and Knight are fighting too. Lady Nephis, feels like the good old times.
What good old times, you fool? What was good about those times? Get your head on straight.
Nephis looked at them with her calm, cold gray eyes, and then smiled. Her smile seemed to illuminate the gloomy autumn day like a ray of sunshine.
Yes, we are being deployed. Get ready and follow me. What can these pathetic abominations do to us? Nothing. Let us burn their filth from this world.
The firekeepers looked at her with expressions of adoration and zealous devotion, passionate fires igniting in their eyes. Their voices joined in a choir.
Follow Lady Changing Star.
Burn them!
Burn them all!
Sunny observed them with a neutral expression as he gathered shadows around him and summoned the Sin of Solace, which immediately started whispering insidious provocations into his ears. A vague figure materializing a few steps away and following behind him. He ignored the hallucination and shook his head in reproach.
What a bunch of crazies.
Led by Nephis, Sunny, and Jet, the firekeepers surged forward. They were aiming for the section of the Joint Army's formation where the flood of nightmare creatures had broken through the dam of human bodies, threatening to consume them all. Somewhere out there, far ahead, Effie and Kai were already trying to stall the fatal advance of the frenzied abominations as they waited for their reinforcements to arrive. Their soldiers were fighting fiercely, without a doubt, and yet the horde had already gained momentum. So the wolves and the night singers had no hope of stopping it on their own. They were just 200 men and women who had volunteered to join the Second Army after all. No matter how elite of a status the two companies earned because of their strength, valor, and the fame of their commanders, they were still ordinary awakened. The firekeepers were different. Even though there were just about 50 of them, each of the people following Changing Star was a seasoned veteran of the Dark City. They were the best and the brightest of what humanity had to offer, simply for the fact that nothing less would have allowed one to survive the cruel crucible of the Forgotten Shore. They had only grown stronger and more experienced under Cassia's guidance after escaping the Starless Abyss, too. Especially now that the mighty and opulent clan valor stood behind the personal troops of its adopted leader. The Fire Keepers had undergone a comprehensive upgrade of their soul arsenals, with those who needed it receiving enough shards to finish saturating their cores. There were 7 cohorts of them, each more than comparable to the most elite household troops of the great clans in terms of power. So, despite their modest numbers, the Fire Keepers were a force to be reckoned with. And that was without even mentioning the 3 masters who were leading them into battle. Due to their superior physical prowess, Sunny, Nephis, and Jet naturally ended up at the head of the rushing force. There was no clever plan for their advance. The situation prohibited careful maneuvering and strategic placement of the Awakened according to their specializations, but there was no real need to waste time on it either. Every Firekeeper knew what they were doing. The remains of the Dreamer army had long become a well-oiled, perfectly synergized combat machine. They all knew what their comrades were good at, what their aspects and memories possessed, and how to work together in a seamless, deadly harmony. Well, maybe Sunny did not quite know all those things exactly. He was more or less familiar with what the members of Cassia's former personal cohort were capable of, as well as a few other people with whom he had fought side by side during the civil war of the Bright Castle. He lacked the qualifications to effectively lead these veteran warriors. However, that was fine. He didn't want to lead anymore. Anyway, Sunny was more than happy to leave all that to Nephis today. His role was quite simple: to wreak as much havoc and destruction among the nightmare creatures as he could. That way he would bring the most benefit to the men and women fighting by his side. His desire to show how lethal he could be in a battle had a different purpose as well. Sunny wanted the others, Morgan and Shan in particular, to witness how much of a fierce force he was on the battlefield. Having some respect from the representatives of the great clans would be convenient in the coming months, but mostly, he wanted to deceive them. People were usually good at one thing or another. Great fighters were very rarely amazing utility specialists, and people specializing in subterfuge were usually less capable in direct combat. Of course, there were always freaks like Sunny, who could do anything from swinging a sharp sword to weaving memories. But they were rare enough for a subconscious bias to subtly deny their existence. The more capable of a fighter Sunny would show himself to be, the harder it would become for people who didn't know him to assume that he also possessed other formidable abilities, like excelling in stealth or being a master of utility. It was a different kind of deception. In the past, Sunny had tried extremely hard to remain under the radar, hiding his power to appear weak and insignificant. That ship, sadly, had long sailed. After coming to Antarctica, he was forced to reveal enough of his strength so that no sane person would ever think of him as a weakling. So now, he needed a new disguise. And today was the day he would start to create it.
Come on, look at me. Look at the devil of Antarctica. Am I not strong? Am I not fearsome? Am I not a frenzied beast, just like what a lofty legacy would expect an uneducated brute from the outskirts to be?
As Sunny ran, he gathered the shadows from the shadow lantern around his body, manifesting them into the shape of a towering, four-armed fiend. He wielded the Sin of Solace in one hand, the Cruel Sight in another. The other two remained free, to be used to tear the enemies apart with sharp claws, or switch to a two-handed grip of the Jade Jian on the fly. A moment later, he circulated his essence and activated the mantle trait of the marble shell. A fearsome armor of black onyx suddenly encased the tenebrous spawn into an impervious carapace, coming together with a dull clangor. Sunny was not going to use finesse and cunning tricks today. No, what he was going for was maximum carnage, maximum barbarity. The more feral he appeared, the better. God knew he had some pent-up anger to vent. They had already flashed through the ranks of the retreating soldiers that belonged to the crushed companies. He could already see the wolves and the night singers fighting ahead, stubbornly refusing to give ground to the onslaught of abominations. A glimpse of Effie's lustrous steel figure ignited his heart, flooding his body with strength and vigor. There were a lot of nightmare creatures in front of him.
Damn.
Sonny summoned the dying wish, slotting it into the mantle and activating the underworld armament trait of the Onyx armor.
Now for the finishing touch.
Finally, he summoned the extraordinary rock, placing it into the mouth of the shadow spawn and activating the sonorous enchantment to make the transferred voice sound as loud as possible. As the fire keepers closed in on the desperate melee, the towering four-armed fiend that moved at the head of Changing Star's force raised his horned head and let out an earth-shattering, chilling, bloodthirsty roar. For a moment, it seemed as though the whole battlefield around them was momentarily frozen. Even the nightmare creatures seemed a little taken aback. Cradled in the embrace of shadows, Sonny smiled with satisfaction.
Yes, I think that will do the trick.
Sonny's life had been pretty complicated as of late, but right now it was very simple. All he had to do was kill. Kill, kill, kill. Even the Sin of Solus seemed to be enjoying the spectacle. There was no more hiding, no more caution, no more trying to undersell his abilities. Well, at least the most obvious and visible of his abilities. Sonny had many more tricks up his sleeve, and in fact, this display of power was meant to misdirect his opponents and draw their attention away from his more insidious talents. However, even that did not matter right now. All that mattered was murder. Dashing through the formation of the wolves and night singers like a bolt of lightning made of darkness, Sonny tore into the tide of nightmare creatures. The echo of his deafening roar was still rolling across the battlefield when the Sin of Solus wreaked its first life. It passed through the body of a massive abomination, easily rending it into two halves.
You have slain your shadow, Bruce.
It was a fallen, huh?
Sonny had activated the Omen of Dread enchantment on the Jade Sword, just for good measure. The faint remnant of a whisper of Ariel, the Demon of Dread, lingered on the cursed blade. All beings who witnessed it had no choice but to be stricken by terror. The nightmare creatures seemed to slow down a little. The awakened soldiers behind him trembled too. However, they were also being affected by the dying wish. Fear and inspiration fused together in their hearts to produce savage awe. The soldiers surged forward, their spirits ignited with killing intent. The abominations, meanwhile, were being assaulted both by the feeling of fear and the irresistible desire to rip the dreadful four-armed fiend to shreds above all else. Such a contradiction was enough to drive one mad.
Good. Give me madness. Give me insanity. The more the better.
Didn't the Sin of Solus feel especially light, sharp, and lethal today? Maybe it was just the effect of his body being augmented by 5 shadows. Full of rapturous malice, Sonny continued to move. His mind was cold, calculating, and full of dark, murderous glee. His shell was brimming with so much power that it seemed as though it would soon burst at the seams. His hands moved faster than his thoughts.
Kill.
The Jade Sword flashed through the air, sending an abomination's head flying away in a fountain of blood. The cruel sight pierced the throat of another and ignited with incandescent light, filling the air with the smell of burnt flesh. His tail shot forward, the armored spike on its tip shattering a monstrous abomination's temple. Sonny whipped his tail, throwing the collapsing corpse into the mob of beasts. All of it took a split second. A monster lunged at him, its maw full of sharp fangs. Sonny caught it with his 2 lower hands, his armored gauntlets scraping against bone, and tore the creature's jaws apart. At the same time, he severed another abomination from top to bottom with the pristine blade of the Sin of Solus. At the same time, he gutted a third one with the silver short sword that was burning with the immolating heat of divine flames.
All of you die!
At the same time, Nephis entered the melee. Changing Star was wearing the black armor forged by the Smiths of Valor, wielding a sword that seemed to be made of pure white flame. Her silver hair flew in the wind like a radiant crown, and on her forehead was a simple band of metal adorned by a single gem, the Dawn Shard. All around them, the memories wielded by the awakened soldiers suddenly grew vastly more powerful. Neph's skin was suffused with a brilliant white glow. She looked like a spirit of pristine flame, and in front of her, the nightmare creatures seemed to melt and turn to ash. Her incandescent sword moved with such speed and precision that it was almost invisible. All that could be seen was the carnage left in its wake. Sonny had not seen Nephis fight in a long, long time, and he had almost forgotten how beautiful her skill was. But she was an ascended now, and so swordsmanship was not her only tool. As the corpses of the nightmare creatures she had slain caught fire, that fire swelled and moved as if being controlled by an invisible will. The air rippled from the unbearable heat, and the flames surged forward in an immolating wave. A deafening explosion rang, ripping a dozen abominations apart. As Changing Star moved through the mass of them, the fires moved with her, like a whirlwind burning and incinerating the nightmare creatures in her path, tearing an APC-sized monster limb from limb. Sonny frowned.
That won't do. She's stealing my spotlight.
At that moment, Jet finally joined them, followed by the Fire Keepers. The tide of abominations was momentarily pushed back. Neph's voice drowned out the cacophony of battle.
Spread out, hold the line, ascended, step forward.
The 7 cohorts of the Fire Keepers separated, reinforcing the faltering line of the Wolves and the Night Singers. At the same time, 5 figures stepped forward to become the wave breakers against the flood of abominations. Nephis, Sonny, Effie, Kai, and Jet.
What a fearsome quintet.
Sonny spared a split second to appreciate the image of them standing against the tide of nightmare creatures, and then threw all unnecessary thoughts out of his mind. His task had only grown harder. Now he had to outdo all these monstrous talents. Commanding the extraordinary rock to let out a harrowing growl, one stolen from the demented corrupted devil, Myriad Eater, no less. He launched himself forward. The Sin of Solus whispered as it severed flesh and bone. The cruel sight sang. Claws, fangs, and spikes rang against the onyx surface of the mantle. The nightmare creatures shrieked, howled, and wailed as they died. The 4-armed fiend had turned into a dark maelstrom as he slaughtered one abomination after another, sometimes 2, 3, 4 at a time. The weaker monsters fell like autumn leaves in front of his blades and claws. The stronger ones were obliterated in a most cold and ruthless way. There were no ingenious schemes to how Sonny fought, no cunning tricks, just pure, savage, calmly calculated butchery. The soldiers behind him were looking at the rampaging spawn of shadows with awe in their eyes. Sonny did not pay their gazes a lot of attention. However, he did regret not leaving a shadow to keep an eye on Morgan and Seishan. He was a bit curious about their reactions, but only a bit. Killing as many abominations as he could, as fast as he could, was much more important. The radiant Changing Star, the steel-bodied raised by wolves, the swift and deadly Nightingale, the death incarnate Soul Reaper, and the Devil of Antarctica, the most fiendish of them all. The 5 of them brought the horde of nightmare creatures to a halt for a while. It was a strange thing to see. The remnants of the Dreamer army were fighting against an overwhelming horde of nightmare creatures, with the members of Changing Star's cohort leading them. It was almost as if they had gathered to reenact the ruinous siege of the Crimson Spire. Of course, not everyone who had participated in that battle was here, but most were. Out of the 100 or so sleepers that had returned from the Forgotten Shore, more than half chose to follow Cassia, and were now fighting for Nephis. A few decided to stay independent, like Sunny or Eiko. A few joined lesser legacy clans, while the second largest group, the surviving handmaidens, followed Shan into the embrace of the great clan's song. The former handmaidens were here on the battlefield too, although not in this exact spot.
It's like a morbid reunion.
The Fire Keepers were fighting like the expert slayers they were. No abomination, no matter how terrifying, could shake their fighting spirit and resolve. Not because they were fearless, but simply because the survivors of the Forgotten Shore had been inoculated against the fear of nightmare creatures by being exposed to too much of it, too early, and with too harrowing results. It was especially clear how out of the norm they were in contrast with the ordinary awakened that comprised the two elite companies, the Wolves and Night Singers. No matter how brave and capable the awakened under the command of Effie and Kai were, they simply could not compare to the unflinching lethality of the eerily calm Fire Keepers. And of course, the members of Changing Stars cohort were the deadliest of them. Effie was like a wall of steel. Nothing could move her, and nothing could move past her. All the abominations could do was die, either pierced by her spear or broken by her shield. Kai was swift, elusive, and unpredictable. The months of fighting a bitter war against Solvane zealots in the Nightmare had forged him into a more capable warrior than he was giving himself credit for. The enchanting young man moved like wind among the abominations, cutting them down with his sharp saber. His ivory armor seemed to shine as it reflected Changing Stars' light. Nephis herself was like a radiant omen of death. Her ruthless sword seemed inescapable, and where it could not reach, incinerating flames reached instead. Shining like a beacon of light in the dark sea of nightmare creatures, she was without a doubt the heart of the battle, and the guiding star that kept hope alive in the hearts of the struggling soldiers. As long as the immortal flame burned, humanity would not be extinguished. Even those who were indifferent to such sentimental proclamations were compelled to believe it now, watching the beautiful white radiance of Changing Stars' light devour the dark tide of nightmare creatures. There was Jet as well. Although not a part of the former Dreamer army, she was no less deadly than the rest of them, maybe even more so. There was nothing particularly flashy about how she fought, but nonetheless, the number of dead abominations surrounding her was staggering. The more of them died, the more alive she looked. It was a sight both disturbing and beautiful. And lastly, there was Sunny. In the past, he had perhaps been the most unassuming member of Changing Stars' cohort. Every impossible feat he had performed, every improbable victory he had achieved, all of it had happened where no one could bear witness, very much so by design. Today, however, Sunny was at the center of everyone's attention, because he was just too savage, brutal, and domineering. The slaughter he was perpetrating could only be described as barbarous. Towering at 3 meters of height, crowned by twisting horns and clad in fearsome onyx armor, the frenzied four-armed fiend tore through the nightmare creatures like a man possessed by a devil. Or was he a devil possessed by a man? All 4 of his hands were sleek with blood. His armor was slick with blood. Even his face was covered in blood, because Sunny had used his sharp teeth to bite through an abomination's throat at some point, finding it more convenient than bringing his sword around. He did not know if he was the deadliest of the 5 masters today, but he was definitely the most eye-catching and frightening. The Sin of Solace laughed. Sunny laughed as well. His laughter escaped from between the fangs of the Shadow Spawn's shell as a ragged breath.
It's really funny we are all going to die.
Indeed, Despite how excellent the firekeepers were and how deadly their leaders were, the situation did not look good. And it was for one simple reason. The Awakened and the Masters were putting on a splendid fight, slaying countless abominations and preventing the Horde from pouring into the breach. The Titans were tied up by the Saints, and without them, there was nothing on the battlefield that the five of them could not face. If it were any other group of Ascended, perhaps things would have been different. But they were not just any Masters. They were perhaps the five most powerful Masters alive, not counting monsters like Mordred and Morgan. The problem was that their essence, as well as the essence of their soldiers, was being slowly depleted, while the tide of abominations was seemingly endless. But there was one big problem with that. Only Jet could fight indefinitely, but she alone was not enough to change the scales of this massive battle. Sunny wondered if he should summon Nightmare and Saint, but something was holding him back. Slicing through a corrupted demon and emerging from the severed carcass to thrust the blade of the cruel sight into the chest of a howling abomination, he briefly glanced in the direction where a revolting mountain of flesh was being slowly carved apart by invisible swords. Sunny was pretty sure that, together with Neff, he could take down one of these titans. Perhaps he wouldn't be able to do it alone, not without substantial preparations at least, and perhaps Changing Star wouldn't be able to do it alone either. But together, they could. All they would have to do was bestow all of their blessings, all of his shadows, and all of the heat of Neff's flame onto Saint and send her forth. His taciturn devil was already immensely powerful, and if her strength were augmented 15 times over, even a corrupted titan would perhaps have to retreat. A fallen one would just die. However, it was not the titans Sunny was worried about. It was the Saints. Today they were fighting nightmare creatures, but one day soon, they would most likely have to fight one or several of the 7 Saints dominating the battlefield. Whispering Blade, Beastmaster, Summer Night, Silent Stalker, Direfang, perhaps even Saint Tyrus. There was Mordred too, and Morgan, and Shan. These people were no less frightening than the Titans. They could be considered more terrifying than the dreaded nightmare creatures. So Sunny was reluctant to reveal his hand. His life could very well depend on it. Without ever slowing his bloody rampage, he started considering his options. If Sunny wanted to do something drastic, he had to do it now, while his reserves of essence were still somewhat substantial. He thought long and hard as he continued killing one abomination after another in increasingly wild and ruthless ways, making the soldiers pale in sickened awe. And in the end, Sunny decided to do nothing.
Cassia must have a plan.
It had not escaped his attention that the blind girl subtly manipulated the events of the battle, making sure that the Firekeepers, the Wolves, and the Night Singers, the 3 units led by the members of Changing Star's cohort, ended up together in this particular spot of the battlefield. If she had put them here, she must have been reasonably certain that they would not be swallowed up by the Horde. As for how they would prevail, Sunny decided that he did not care. Today, he would care only about one thing: how to kill many, many nightmare creatures, as many of them as possible. The Sin of Solace laughed, its voice full of gleeful amusement.
Yes, right. Kill them all.
Focusing solely on causing as much devastation as possible, Sunny slaughtered the nightmare creatures. The power of the fully augmented Shadow Fiend shell was staggering. That power was so great, in fact, that getting drunk on it was simply too easy. However, he did not. His savage butchery was just for show. Even though Sunny had allowed himself to gleefully dive into the battle frenzy, the core of his mind remained cold and clear. The more abominations he slayed, the more somber that part of his consciousness became.
What the hell is Morgan doing?
The Fire Keepers were supposed to hinder the advance of the nightmare creatures until reinforcements were pulled out from other parts of the battlefield to repair the breach in the army's formation. They had done that already, but the reinforcements never arrived. Had another crisis prevented Morgan from sending more companies to replace them? Or was something else at play? Sonny did not know, and he had no time to care. He might have made it look as though cutting through numerous abominations was effortless for him and brought him nothing but vicious joy, but it was not an easy task. He was strong, fast, and immensely skilled. His armor and weapons were outstanding too. However, there were just too many enemies pressing down on the 5 masters and their soldiers. The horde of nightmare creatures truly seemed endless. Even if most of these abominable creatures were not strong enough to threaten Sonny, and easy to kill, the sheer number of them posed a threat. His task was not just to withstand the flood of monsters, but to cut through it, breaking its momentum. And that was a perilous task. Sonny had to watch his every step and keep the next dozen steps in mind. Otherwise, it would be too easy to end up in a situation where there was no next step to take. Granted, he could carve his way out of many situations that would have doomed a different Ascended, but still, Sonny had to be careful about where he moved and what he did. The others were struggling with the same issue. Kai had it the easiest, since his speed and the ability to fly made maneuvering around the battlefield almost a non-issue. Nephis had some breathing room too, because her flames could clear out the space around her. Sonny, Effie, and Jet were starting to struggle though. Chances were they would have to retreat into the formation of the Awakened soon. Once that happened, the formation itself would come under much more strain.
Not yet, though.
He was not done playing the role of a Dark Slayer yet. Nestled within the embrace of shadows, Sonny gritted his teeth and continued to fight. This was good. He had missed that feeling. The feeling of giving it your all and fighting with your very life on the line. Back in the Antarctic Center, he had always been like a detached observer. He had played the role of a person who was just as desperate and frightened as everyone else around him. But that was a lie. He wasn't. Sonny had just allowed himself to lose himself in the role. In truth, he had rarely been in true danger in the past few months. It had always been the lives of others that he desperately wanted to preserve, not his own. The times when Sonny found himself in mortal danger in Antarctica had been few, and the forces aligned against him back then were too insurmountable to fight. All he could do was escape. Even against the Winter Beast, his own life had not been at risk until the very end. It was the same now. However, Sonny had tricked himself into feeling that it wasn't. And so, he killed the nightmare creatures. He killed as many as there were. He slayed the weaker abominations with ease, almost in passing. His towering figure seemed to move with the vicious, blood-chilling grace of a natural killer. Red mist and howls of agony surrounded him like a dark mantle. The stronger abominations took some time to bring down, but they inevitably fell as well. There were too few beings in Antarctica that could withstand his strength, his skill, and the perfect sharpness of the Sin of Solace. The only creatures here that could give Sonny pause were the devils, simply because their powers were varied and unpredictable. But by now, there were enough tools in his toolbox to handle most of these threats. It was just a matter of identifying the strengths of the enemy and finding a way to turn that strength into a weakness. Everyone and everything fell under his blade. Slowly, a mound of corpses grew in front of Sonny, forming a natural barrier against the advancing horde. At first, he was pleased by the additional protection the morbid palisade presented. But once the mound grew tall enough, the nightmare creatures started lunging at Sonny from above. That was not ideal. However, Sonny continued to fight. Even when the immovable Effie was pushed back and forced to rejoin the formation, he remained just where he was, performing his brutal dance of death. Even when the relentless Soul Reaper cursed through gritted teeth and retreated, he continued to kill. Even when Nimble Kai soared high into the sky, dismissing his sword to summon a bow, he still refused to take a step back. In the end, there were just two of them left in front of the formation, Sunny and Nephis. One was like an angel surrounded by white radiance and light. The other, like a demon, shrouded in darkness and shadows. Both fought with cold ruthlessness, unflinching resolve to obliterate the enemy at any cost. It was almost as if they were competing to see who could slay more. Sunny did his damnedest to be the one to win that competition. At some point, fighting an especially powerful abomination, he felt the shadow shell start to come undone. Without hesitation, Sunny dismissed the mantle and summoned back the graceless dusk. Then he allowed the form of the shadow spawn to dissipate and lunged from its crumbling carapace at the enemy. The Sin of Solus flashed. At the same time, the scorpion tail of the nightmare creature shot forward. It pierced the impervious silk of his tunic, and his stone-like skin as well, plunging deep into his flesh. Grimacing, Sunny beheaded the Manticora and pushed himself off its harrowing sting and used the fully charged Dying Wish to heal his wounds. Then, as if nothing had happened, he continued to kill. He had grown weaker without the support of the Shadow Fiend shell, but also nimbler and much harder to pin down. His jade sword never stopped reaping lives. Now that Sunny was wearing the graceless dusk again, though, there were a few more things he could do. Glancing in the direction where nightmare creatures seemed to disappear into white radiance, one after another without a trace, Sunny hesitated for a moment and then activated the Blessing of Dusk. And then said in a relaxed, leisurely tone,
"Hey, Neff, how's it going?"
There were a few moments of silence. In these moments, Sunny managed to dodge a spiked tentacle, slice through it with his sword, grab the bleeding stump, and toss the slithering creature over his head, impaling it on the horns of a different abomination. Then he sidestepped the charging beast and cut through its legs, causing it to topple to the ground. A third strike of the Sin of Solus finished both creatures off. That was when Neff's response finally arrived. "It's a bit distracting, you know, to have someone speak in your head all of a sudden." Sunny grinned. The connection the Blessing of Dusk established was a mental one, so it was not exactly like hearing her voice. Nevertheless, Changing Star's thoughts sounded a bit strained.
"You didn't answer my question."
Now that Sunny lost the protection of the Shadow Fiend shell and retracted the mantle back into his skin, he had to be more careful. Receiving direct blows was not out of the question, but it could throw him off balance. He had to use the Feather of Truth judiciously to account for the difference in mass between him and the opponents. And of course, being struck by anything corrupted could end in disaster. Something flashed from the direction where Nephis was fighting, and a moment later, her voice resounded in his head. "As expected, I guess. But Sunny, what has gotten into you? You don't seem like yourself today."
So she noticed.
His grin widened. A dozen or so meters to his left, the air rippled slightly. A chameleon-like creature was moving there, unseen. If not for the subtle fluctuation of the shadows, he would have never noticed it. The abomination had already moved past Sunny, swiftly approaching the awakened soldiers behind him, which was not good. Since it had enough presence of mind to ignore the pull of the Dying Wish, the chameleon had to be at least a demon, and a strong one at that. Sunny twisted his torso and tossed the Sin of Solus into the air. The soldiers were all busy desperately resisting the flood of nightmare creatures, but they could not help but take a glance at the spectacularly brutal slaughter that was taking place in front of them. Those who knew Sunny were all surprised and a little startled. Those who did not were chilled to the bone and in awe of his vicious lethality, which was why many people noticed the jade sword seemingly slipping out of his hand. Their eyes widened. The Sin of Solus spun as it flew away, and then stopped abruptly, floating above the ground. A stream of blood suddenly flowed out of thin air, and then a revolting reptilian creature was suddenly there, its chest pierced by the white sword. The creature swayed and fell. The soldiers paled. The demon was mere steps away from reaching the formation. Before the chameleon could stand up or crawl forward, several spears pierced its flesh, killing it. As for Sonny, he was already busy fighting another abomination. Sin of Solus dissipated so that he could summon it back.
Don't seem like myself. Well, I did have many new and exciting experiences at the Antarctic Center, so I was bound to change a little. Don't mind it, though. I'm just performing in front of your sister. And speaking of your sister...
He counted the seconds until the Jade Jian returned, dodging a flurry of blows like a slippery eel.
Is she trying to get rid of you or what? Surely you've noticed that the reinforcements that were supposed to replace us are nowhere to be seen. If this continues, we will have to retreat or die. Wait, it's not some sort of stupid test, is it? A true daughter of valor will never surrender to the nightmare creatures or some such crap?
Nephis lingered for a moment.
No, I don't know what she is doing. There must be a reason, but it is hard to say. Perhaps it has to do with putting pressure on Shan to reveal some of what her handmaidens are capable of. Perhaps there's something else.
Sonny grimaced.
You're calm, considering the situation?
He saw her through the gaps between the rushing nightmare creatures. Neph had summoned her helmet, brilliant white radiance shining through the slit of its visor and the seams of the graceful armor. It was as though there was nothing beneath its black steel but pure light. Sonny could not see her face, but he knew how much pain fighting like this for that long was causing her. Nephis was most likely approaching her limits, too.
Do I seem calm?
He finally felt the slight weight of the Sin of Solus in his hand. Shifting his stance, Sonny immediately switched from being evasive to being ruthlessly lethal.
Don't you know? You always seem calm.
He killed the abomination that was trying to crush him with a stone hammer by severing both of its arms and its head, then added,
Should we go all out?
Each of them was holding something back. They could reveal their full power to save their lives, but it would only save them once. Nephis answered after a long second of silence.
No, trust in Cassia. If she chose to put us here, there must be a reason.
Sonny smiled. Her thinking was very similar to his own. But trusting someone was not easy for him. Trusting Cassia and trusting in Cassia were different things, and neither of them was simple.
Well, what the hell is her reason?
He would have loved to ponder that question more, but at that moment, a deafening shriek suddenly shook the world. Sonny was rather proud of the battle roar he had produced earlier with the help of the extraordinary rock. But compared to this sky-splitting wail, it seemed like a placid whisper. Looking up, he saw an enormous scaled beast plummeting from the whirlwind of crows, its body wreathed in arcs of searing lightning. One of the rotting wings of the flying horror had been completely torn off, a river of vile miasma flowing from the terrible wound like a waterfall of corruption. It seemed that Skytide and Wake of Ruin were the first to overcome their opponent. Sonny's eyes widened. The wounded titan looked like he was falling directly on his head.
Well, that's new.
Sonny had lived through many unthinkable disasters, managing to survive in the most dire and seemingly inescapable situations. The improbable tales of his close brushes with death could probably fill a book. However, he had definitely never had a titan fall on his head.
What the hell is this?
The great scaled beast was plummeting to the ground, its body riddled with terrible wounds. One of its 3 long necks was severed, the other hung lifelessly, held by only a few threads of flesh. Of its wings, only one remained. A cloud of vile miasma trailed behind it like a harrowing cloak. The creature was maybe 24 seconds away from crashing into the ground. Sunny froze for a moment, stunned by the frightening visage of the titan that had been cast down from the skies. He wasn't the only one. Nephis was looking up too, and so were the soldiers. Even the nightmare creatures halted, raising their bestial heads to witness the fall of one of their lords.
Not good.
Neph was the first to react. Her voice rolled across the battlefield, pulling the awakened out of their shocked inaction.
Pull back, fighting retreat. Move if you want to live.
At the same time, she sent Sunny a mental message.
Sunny, I am going to stall the horde to cover the retreat. You do as you wish.
The meaning of her words was clear. What Neph meant to say was help me. But due to the nature of their bond, she couldn't, because that would be an order. Sunny hesitated. Behind him, every second awakened turned around and dashed back. Those who remained doubled their efforts to resist the flood of abominations who had already recovered from their momentary passivity. One of the soldiers who fell back ran for a few seconds. They turned around and assembled into a loose line. Then, it was the turn of those who had stayed behind to retreat. Like that, alternating between running and fighting, the firekeepers, the wolves, and the night singers started to move away from the perceived impact zone. Of course, such a maneuver was perilous and had the potential to result in many casualties. Every time you turned your back on the enemy in battle, you were risking your life after all. But with the help of the experienced firekeepers and the 3 masters who had joined the formation, the soldiers managed to preserve their lives through the hasty retreat. Changing Star, meanwhile, moved forward. The ring of flame that ranged around her changed, growing narrower. A few moments later, the fire seemed to be absorbed into her radiant figure. Clad in black armor and wreathed in blinding white flames, Nephis took a second step. Sunny sighed.
Do as I wish, huh?
What he wished to do today was make a suitable kind of impression, and the impression he was going for was that of someone who would never retreat from a trivial nuisance like a plummeting titan. Opening the gate of the shadow lantern, he called forth all the shadows that were stored inside and sent them forth. In front of Sunny, a wall of shadows suddenly rose from the ground, blocking off a wide swath of the battlefield. The tide of nightmare creatures was momentarily stemmed. At the same time, far to his left, Nephis unleashed her flames. The wrought fire that she had wrapped tightly around her armor and compressed into a furious mass of incinerating white radiance was suddenly devoid of the pressure of her control. It furiously exploded forward. A deafening explosion rang out, and a crudely directed wave of white flame rolled from her staggering figure in a wide fan. It swallowed many ranks of nightmare creatures. Some were torn to tiny pieces and turned to ash, crumbling into nothingness. Some survived, receiving terrible and debilitating burns. Together, Sunny and Nephis had managed to build a temporary dam that blocked the path of the abominations. Half of the dam was the wall of shadows, and the other half was the wave of flames. Of course, that dam would not last long, and both of them had spent the lion's share of their remaining essence to produce this wide-scale effect. The wall was already cracking, and the wave was already dying down. But it was enough to buy the soldiers time to retreat. And before their dam fully collapsed, the shadow of the fallen Colossus covered the ground.
Crap.
Sonny felt the impact of the massive body before his vision registered it. That was because he suddenly found himself flying, the ground disappearing from beneath his feet. As a violent tremor traveled through the battlefield, splitting the ground apart, he hit the dirt and rolled, sensing his skin burn. Sonny could feel a powerful gale assault him with furious force, but he was blinded by the cloud of the vile miasma that had covered everything around him. He realized that it was Skytide pushing the noxious cloud away from the army's formation. However, Sonny was too deep into the miasma. Even though he had stopped breathing and closed his eyes, he could still feel the deadly poison seep into his skin. Marble Shell and Bloodwave were preventing his flesh from rotting and dissolving for now. He did not know how long his defenses would last, though. The miasma flowing from within the body of the scaled beast was much more virulent and powerful than any toxin he had encountered before.
This is just great.
Sonny summoned the Essence Pearl. As soon as the memory manifested itself, he placed it in his mouth, regaining the ability to breathe without inhaling deadly poison. He still hesitated to open his eyes, though, perceiving the world through the shapes and movements of shadows. The shadows were a mess. It was hard to tell exactly what was going on around him. All he could feel was a sea of nightmare creatures wailing in agony as their bodies were being dissolved by the miasma. It was sort of ingenious. By controlling the wind to blow the cloud away from the human formation, St. Tyrus was pushing it into the horde of abominations. It did not matter that the Titan had been on their side. The nightmare creatures plunged into the miasma were doomed to be destroyed, just like humans would be. The devastation was so thorough that in this section of the battlefield, the pressure on the defensive line of Awakened had drastically lessened. Nothing would be able to pass through the breach now. So that problem was solved. The problem that remained was that Sonny and Nephis had found themselves within the cloud of miasma. Changing Star could probably burn the poison away with her flames, but he was having a very unpleasant time.
Damn it. Escape. I need to escape back to where the Firekeepers had retreated.
But Sonny was all turned around because of the earthquake from the Titan's fall. Where to go? He gritted his teeth, then ordered two of the shadows to slip off his body and dash away in two different directions. With some luck, one of them would leave the noxious cloud and show him the way. Before that happened, however...
Crap.
Sonny felt a massive shadow lunging at him from somewhere unseen. He blindly slashed with the Sin of Solus, feeling the jade blade bite into something extremely tough, then sink into something soft. Then something hard crashed into him, and he was sent flying for the second time at the last minute. This time, Sonny fell on a pile of abomination corpses. He felt sharp spikes and scales scrape against the silk of the graceless dusk and rolled down, tracking the movements of the massive shadow. What the hell was it? It didn't seem to have legs or arms, simply floating above the ground. One thing was certain, though. The thing, whatever it was not feeling well. Its movements were chaotic and resembled convulsions. Even without the deathly miasma and the strike delivered by Sonny, the creature was in a sorry state. He still refused to open his eyes, though. If he did, however, he would have seen a ghastly head swaying above the ground. It was held up by a long neck that arched up and disappeared into the haze of the miasma. The head was covered by tough scales and had the hilt of the Sin of Solus protruding from a crack in its skull. The head swayed madly, opening its maw, and shot forward in a frenzied desire to swallow Sonny. But before it could, the long neck convulsed one last time, and the demented light slowly disappeared from the frenzied eyes of the creature. The head slammed into the ground a few meters away from him and grew still. As for Sonny, he suddenly heard the voice of the spell whisper into his ears. The spell said,
"You have slain a fallen Titan. Devoured seeker of truth, your shadow grows stronger. You have received a memory.
He froze.
What?
Then, Sonny almost spat out the essence pearl.
What just happened?
When did he kill a Titan? He did no such thing. Sonny's shock was so great that he even forgot about the cloud of miasma eating at his skin for a moment. Slowly, he understood the sequence of what had transpired. The scaled beast had fallen somewhere ahead, inside the horde of abominations. The tremor produced by the impact must have thrown Sonny closer to the Titan. The creature had already been on the verge of death when he accidentally stumbled on its last head. That was the massive shadow that had suddenly lunged at him. And he struck it with the sin of Solus, delivering the finishing blow through pure chance. Sonny would have laughed if not for the need to keep his mouth shut. He shook his head in disbelief.
This is a bit awkward, isn't it?
That was the second kill he had stolen from St. Tyrus. Was it her fate to deliver Sonny powerful nightmare creatures to slaughter? First the remnant of the Jade Queen, now the defiled seeker of truth.
Well, I'm sure that Skytide is above being petty about such stuff. Plus, she doesn't need to know that it was me. There's a sea of abominations here. Any of them could have delivered the last strike. Nightmare creatures are known to devour their own, after all.
Still, that was the second Titan Sonny had killed. If not for the fact that both of the kills were somewhat murky, he would be going around demanding that people call him the Titan Slayer. The sales of the Brilliant Emporium would skyrocket if its proprietor had such an illustrious title. He shook his head again, then stood up. First, he had to escape the damned miasma.
I must have hit my head when I fell.
One of his shadows had just discovered the correct path, but Sonny belatedly realized that he could have just moved in the direction opposite of where the wind was blowing. St. Tyrus was pushing the cloud away from the human formation after all, so that was where the formation had to be. As he made the first step, the burning sensation gnawing at his skin suddenly disappeared, replaced by searing but pleasant heat. Then Sonny was surrounded by bright light. He opened his eyes at the same moment as a strong hand gripped his shoulder. Nephis was standing by his side, both of them surrounded by a whirlwind of flame. The fire burned away the miasma, creating a pocket of clean, if somewhat thin, air. "Are you all right?" Sonny lingered for a moment, then nodded and smiled crookedly.
Better than ever.
Hearing her actual voice was unexpectedly nice. "Good. Then let's get out of here." Neph threw a glance at the head of the Titan that lay on the ground a few meters away from them. The harrowing maw opened in an eternal, silent scream. Then, without saying anything, she pulled Sonny away. He followed.
Yes, getting the hell out of here sounds like a great plan.
By the time Sonny and Nephis escaped from the noxious cloud, the situation on the battlefield had changed. The wolves, the night singers, and the firekeepers were cut off from the nightmare creatures by the deathly miasma, so they received a few moments of respite. The poison itself, meanwhile, was blown into the depths of the horde by Skytide's winds, wreaking havoc among the abominations. Suddenly, the pressure on the center of the army formation lessened. The fighting on the flanks, however, only grew more furious. Sonny reached the line of soldiers, passed between the forward fighters, and plopped down on the ground, breathing heavily. Nephis was in no better state than him. Worse, actually. The pain of having to use her abilities for so long had taken a toll on her. She lowered herself to the ground near him, staring at the mud with distant eyes. The awakened met their return with wide smiles, faces shining with relief and triumph. Seeing that the two masters were exhausted and needed to catch their breath, they closed ranks around them and prepared their weapons, watching the hazy wall of swirling miasma with cold focus. If something suddenly lunged at the formation from the poisonous haze, the soldiers were prepared to meet it with sharp blades. Sunny slowly exhaled, returning from the rampant state of battle frenzy. Then, he looked up. The fall of one of the Titans was a great victory in and of itself. However, it had meaning far beyond the death of a powerful abomination. Much more important was the fact that the death of the winged horror would inevitably cause a cascade of meaningful consequences. The chain reaction was already beginning. Now that Wake of Ruin and Skytide were free, each of them moved to provide support in other areas on the battlefield. The steel-winged bird of prey fell like a sword of the heavens, obliterating a vast swath of clawing vines that Summer Night, Dire Fang, and Silent Stalker were fighting against. The vast murder of crows, meanwhile, descended on the horde itself. Saint Kor's strongest suit had never been facing a single overwhelmingly powerful adversary. In the battle against the winged titan, he could only provide support to Tyrus. Now that he was unleashed on a large number of weaker targets, however, Wake of Ruin was finally able to showcase his full, dreadful might. A myriad of crows lunged at the abominations from the dark skies, tearing into them with sharp talons and even sharper beaks. If those were ordinary carrion birds, they would not have been able to do much damage to the monstrous creatures. However, they were not. Each of the crows was a manifestation of a transcendent, and so they easily slaughtered awakened and fallen monstrosities. They assaulted the corrupted abominations too. If one crow was not enough, 10 would gather to riddle the creature with ghastly wounds. If 10 was not enough, 100 would descend on the monster like a hungry cloud. The furious massacre that had taken place was grisly and spectacular. And just like that, the scales of the battle started to shift. With Wake of Ruin helping to lessen the burden of the awakened soldiers, the army formation regained its vigor and even started pushing the horde back. Soon after, a second Titan was slain, the forest of vines growing still and brittle. Once the vine creature died, the fate of the remaining 2 Titans was sealed. The appalling mountain of flesh and the ghostly apparition were felled in short succession, letting every saint turn their attention to the horde. Even then, the outcome of the battle was not yet decided. The advantage was on the side of the humans, but even with the Transcendents joining the fight against the Sea of Nightmare creatures, the saints were all tired and spent after they clashed with the Titans, and the number of abominations was simply too great. There remained truly powerful creatures among them, as well as tyrants, devils, and demons of all kinds. Additionally, nightmare creatures were not humans, nor even sane in any definition of the word. An ordinary enemy would have had their morale broken and fled after sustaining terrible losses and watching 4 mighty titans, the driving force of the horde, fall. But abominations knew no retreat. Even while dying, they only wanted to rip the humans apart. Only total annihilation would lead to their defeat. And so, that was what humans did. Guided by Morgan, the army stood its ground and slaughtered the nightmare creatures until there were none left. A sea of abominations turned into a sea of corpses. The ghastly carpet of monstrous bodies covered the plain, stretching far into the distance. Countless crows filled the sky, and the ground had turned into wet sludge after absorbing rivers of blood. The stench of it all was almost unbearable. And yet, it was the most glorious thing Sunny had ever seen. Staring at the grand battlefield, he couldn't quite believe what he saw. The scale of the battle they had just won was simply too unbelievable. Even after witnessing massive sieges in the Antarctic center, Sonny was unprepared to witness something like this. This time, the humans were not defending, stalling for time while civilians evacuated. This time, they had gone on the offensive, venturing into the wilderness to slay the Titans and the horde the four creatures had caused to assemble. They even succeeded. Even though the evacuation army had achieved many of its goals in the southern quadrant and continued following the plan, this felt like the first true victory Sonny had witnessed since the start of the Chain of Nightmares. And he played a substantial role in achieving it. Sonny studied the changed landscape of the plain with a slightly startled expression. Then, a frown slowly appeared on his face.
What happens next, then?
Right now, all 7 saints were gathered in one spot. Soon they would depart for their siege capitals. Wouldn't that be the perfect opportunity for the great clans to show their fangs? Suddenly grim, Sonny shook his head and turned around, throwing a glance at the tired soldiers around him.
One step at a time.
The divergence from the norm continued after the fighting was over as well. Usually the human forces would hastily retreat from the site of the battle to escape the converging abominations that had been attracted by the noise and the smell of blood. However, the joint army defiantly stayed in place. A field camp was established, surrounded by hastily constructed fortifications. Teams of salvagers prowled the vast battlefield, retrieving soul shards and dismantling the bodies of the most powerful nightmare creatures for precious materials. It was as if the leaders of the expedition force were not at all concerned by the threat of the migrating hordes. On the contrary, they seemed to welcome the danger. The joint army had been assembled to destroy the Titans and reduce the accumulation of nightmare creatures in the area, before the siege capitals could be compromised. Both of these objectives had been achieved, but the Saints decided to cull more abominations while they had a chance. No one knew when Valor Song and the government would join forces again. The fighting on the fringes of the camp would most likely continue through the rest of the day and the entire night, with several smaller hordes being ground against the bulwark of the 7 Saints and their soldiers. None of that concerned Sonny, though. For now, he could just rest. The Firekeepers, the Wolves, and the Night Singers had ended the battle together, so they were assigned the same spot inside the camp. Despite how fierce the fighting had been, casualties were few. None among the survivors of the Forgotten Shore, and a mere handful in the 2 companies led by Effie and Kai. That was mostly thanks to the 5 masters who had shielded the awakened soldiers from the worst of what the Titanic horde had to offer. So the mood inside their section of the camp was more festive than grave. As Sonny walked through the rows of tents toward a supply vehicle where food was being prepared, he received many reactions.
Look, it's him!
Gods almighty, when Master Sunless lured that tyrant to the river, I knew that he was good. But I thought that he was just an extremely competent scout, you know? Who knew that we had such a monster with us this whole time?
A monster? More like a devil. Damn! Now I can see where the nickname comes from. He has to be one of the scariest descended in the quadrant, right? No, in the whole world.
Why are you guys so surprised? Master Sunless is from Changing Stars cohort, like our Wolfie. Of course he's just as crazy as her. I think I'm going to have a dream about him today. I don't know if it'll be a nightmare or, a different kind of dream.
Are you so smitten that you've lost what little brain you used to have, fool? You're an awakened. You don't dream.
Oh, yeah. What a pity. Relief.
Sonny was slightly amused by that last one, but he did not let it show. It seemed that his little performance had worked, at least on these ordinary soldiers. What effect it had on the intended targets, Morgan, Shan, and by extension the forces of the great clans on the continent, remained to be seen. He got a generous portion of army stew and made his way to the tent where the other 4 masters were gathered. The atmosphere inside was relaxed, but none of them had dismissed their armor. Even though the situation seemed to be under control, and the saints appeared to be confident in their ability to protect the camp, one could never know what would happen when the spell was involved. So experienced fighters like them never allowed themselves to completely lower their guards. Kai was absent-mindedly cleaning his face with a wet towel. Nephis was sitting tiredly on a cot. Jet was stretched on another one, with a blissful expression on her face. And Effie, of course. Effie was wolfing down an unreasonable amount of food. When she saw him, however, she forced herself to pause for a moment. The huntress stared at Sunny with wide eyes.
Sunny, what the hell was that? You just boom and went berserk. It was actually sort of spectacular.
Effie paused for a moment and then added with a glint in her eyes.
And since when can you turn into that shadow fiend? Have you transcended? Are you secretly a saint now? No, that can't be right, can it?
He endured the deluge of questions, then coughed.
It's just a trick I picked up in the Antarctic Center. A special application of my ascended ability.
Effie remained silent for a few moments, then shook her head.
You're scary. Let's be friends.
Then she added with a grin.
Oh, and try making that shadow fiend bigger next time. Looking at it made me want to ride you again.
As a strange expression appeared on Jet's face, the huntress started giggling and stuffed a spoonful of stew in her mouth. Sunny shook his head in resignation.
Don't mind her. The fiend was my body in the nightmare, while that overgrown delinquent was sent into the body of a small child, so I let her ride on my shoulders to save time. In retrospect, that was a huge mistake.
Jet smiled at him lazily from her cot.
You don't have to explain, you know.
Sunny briefly glanced at Neff and rolled his eyes.
I know. I still want to, though.
Soul Reaper chuckled.
I see. Well, in any case, good job today. As for what Sunny did and the reputation he earned...
She looked at Kai, Effie, and Nephis with a shrug.
That's just how it goes. In the Antarctic Center, everyone knew how fierce of a fighter he was. Now people in East Antarctica will know too.
Kai lingered for a bit, then said,
We all know it as well, of course. More than anyone. It's just that, Sunny, you usually shy away from the spotlight. Seeing you acting out of character is a little strange. Is everything all right?
Sunny sent his friend a reassuring smile and nodded.
Sure. I shied away from the spotlight because it was convenient, and now I don't because it's more convenient. So don't worry.
Then he looked at Nephis and raised an eyebrow.
And what about you? No comment?
She turned her head and studied him for a few moments. Eventually, Nephis looked away and said simply,
Your swordsmanship has improved.
And that was it. Sunny opened his mouth to respond, but then grew silent. A slight frown appeared on his face. With a sigh, he found himself a seat and concentrated on the food. That was because the shadow he had left outside the tent noticed someone heading their way. Black armor, red cape, vermilion eyes that were sharp enough to cut steel. Morgan was coming to visit them. Sunny settled in a corner and stuffed his mouth with stew. A few moments later, the flap of the tent opened, and Morgan walked in, followed closely by Cassia. The Princess of Valor seemed to be in a good mood. Her strange vermilion eyes were lively and vivid, shining with barely contained excitement. It was as though the calamitous battle had invigorated the usually restrained young woman, revealing a glimpse of her true self. Without the habitual mask of composed decorum, Morgan looked younger. Her words echoed Sunny's thoughts. A pleasant and disturbingly familiar smile appeared on her beautiful face, and with a melodious laugh, Morgan said, "That was spectacular, dear sister, venerable masters. You did not disappoint." With that, her lips twisted a little in an expression of wistful regret. She seemed disappointed by the fact that she had not received a chance to participate in the battle personally. Morgan sighed. "The whole camp is aflame with the tales of what happened in your corner of the battlefield. Even the feats performed by the saints seem to have taken a back seat to what Changing Star has achieved. I'm so proud of my talented, capable little sister. Nicely done." She paused for a moment, and then added with a smile that seemed a little sharper than before, "Your glory is Clan Valor's glory, of course, so I am very happy right now." Sunny silently chewed his food. Hearing the word glory from a descendant of War God rubbed him the wrong way, but he didn't let it ruin his appetite.
Indeed, she is a good reason to be happy.
If the War of the Great Clans was a popularity contest, which it was in a sense, then Valor was currently winning. Not only had Skytide been the first of the Saints to slay her foe, but the potentially catastrophic breach in the defensive formation had also been repaired by Nephis.
Was that why Morgan failed to send us reinforcements? To earn her damned clan some glory?
Sunny frowned. That was a possibility, but a small one. Anvil's daughter was not someone who would sacrifice strategic benefits to earn a little bit of fame, especially because Clan Valor already had too much of it. So he simply glanced at Morgan and asked,
"By the way, what happened to those reinforcements we were supposed to receive?"
Not looking particularly guilty or taken aback by his bluntness, she shrugged. "It didn't seem like you needed any, so I sent them someplace else." Sunny wanted to rebuke her, but then changed his mind and turned his attention back to the stew. They had indeed managed to hold out by themselves in the end. The perspective of the people directly participating in the bloodshed was naturally limited. Morgan, on the other hand, had enjoyed the broad view of the whole battlefield, especially because of Cassia. She must have known that St. Tyrus had been close to defeating the Defiled Seeker of Truth. Morgan might have been the one to coordinate with Skytide and make sure that the Titan fell in front of the breach, sealing it with the cloud of lethal miasma. So, while it seemed as though the Firekeepers had been left for dead from Sunny's perspective, she really could have had no reason to send reinforcements their way.
I'm not sure that I'm buying it. But on the other hand, I'm also not sure that I'm not buying it.
His thoughts were interrupted by the fact that Morgan was staring at him intently. Sunny shifted.
What?
Her smile grew wider. "My dear sister fought admirably, but I expected nothing less from a daughter of valor. You, however, Master Sunless, you gave me a very, very pleasant surprise. It seems that the reports I've read about you were not nearly detailed enough." She took a step closer and leaned forward, staring at him with something that almost resembled hunger. "To be honest, I never understood what my little sister saw in you. But now, I take it all back. She has a good eye. You fought beautifully, Master Sunless. We really should spar sometime. I have not had a good sparring partner in a long, long time. My dear sister indulged me at first, but now she is always busy." Neff's mouth twitched a little. Sunny, meanwhile, shivered under Morgan's burning gaze.
Right. I forgot she's a complete battle maniac.
He coughed awkwardly.
Sure, why not? A friendly spar sounds like a good idea. Oh, but I mostly fight nightmare creatures, so my habits are a bit rough. So do tell me if I get carried away.
Morgan's eyes gleamed with a dangerous light.
That won't be a problem. I tend to get carried away sometimes. That's why it's hard to find suitable sparring partners. Most people are so brittle, you know.
Sonny shrugged.
Can't say that I do.
He was definitely not brittle, so there was no reason to be concerned. A spar was just a spar, after all. So why was he suddenly feeling cold? As if he had just gotten himself into a really sticky situation. Morgan lingered for a few moments, staring at him with gleaming eyes, then shook her head.
Sadly, our spar will have to wait until we return to the siege capital. And about that, sister, might I have a word? There are things we must discuss.
Nephis nodded, then rose from her seat and followed Morgan out of the tent. Soon there were only 5 people inside once again. Cassia stayed behind, sitting quietly in a corner. Sonny finished his stew and asked her in a low tone,
"What is that about?"
The blind girl hesitated for a moment.
They need to plan a route to the siege capital. The way back is shaping up to be perilous, for a few reasons.
He nodded, understanding the underlying message. Then Sonny gave Cassia a complicated look. When things seemed especially dark during battle, Neff had told him to trust in the blind girl. So, what had been Cassia's intent in placing them there? Had she simply known that the Firekeepers would not end up stranded in the Sea of Nightmare creatures? Or had she known more? For example, Sonny would deliver the fatal blow to the wounded Titan if put in that particular spot on the battlefield. And speaking of the dead Titan, there was a memory that Sonny had yet to take a look at.
An ascended memory of the 7th tier.
Putting his plate away, Sonny found a cot, stretched his tired body on it, and closed his eyes. Then he dove into the Soul Sea. Walking past the legion of silent shadows to stand between the 5 dark suns of his lightless soul, Sonny summoned the memory forth. Soon a round hand mirror of dark silver appeared in the air in front of him. Its front looked like a pool of still mercury, while its back was decorated with beautiful engravings. Sonny saw his pale reflection in the silver mirror and suddenly felt an eerie chill creep up his spine. That memory gave him a very ominous feeling. When he took the mirror, it felt strangely heavy in his hand.
Not a weapon, and not an armor. A tool, then? Or a charm?
He hesitated for a moment and summoned the runes. Strings of shimmering symbols appeared in the air surrounding the hand mirror. He read them, frowning slightly. Memory, mirror of truth. Memory rank, ascended. Memory tier, 7. Memory type, tool. The first 4 strings held no surprises. The next few, however. Sonny's eyes widened slightly.
What? Why is that name here?
The first word in the description of the Mirror of Truth was not one that he had expected to see today, but one that he knew all too well. That word was Weaver. Sonny glanced at the hand mirror with a tense expression, a deep scowl appearing on his face. Then, he slowly turned back to the runes and continued to study them. Since the start of the Antarctica campaign, he had often encountered hints and mentions of Ariel, the Demon of Dread. So why did Weaver's name suddenly show up in the runes of a memory? There was only one way to find out. The description read, Memory description. Weaver was known as the Master of Lies, while Ariel was known as the Keeper of Truths. The two were not close and rarely met,
which was why Ariel was surprised to find Weaver staring at his pyramid one day. "Isn't it beautiful, this tomb of mine? Have you come to admire it?" Ariel said. After a moment of silence, Weaver responded, "I have not known that you've built a tomb, nor have I ever seen it. How would I know to admire it? I just happened to be here by chance. Now that I've seen it, my heart is untouched. I feel nothing." Then Weaver asked, "But you seem to feel too much, Demon of Dread. Your face is unsightly. You are smiling, but tears are streaming from your eyes. Why?" Ariel laughed. "I'm not sure." He laughed and cried as he looked at the tomb, saying, "I built it to bury the truth. Truth is the most hideous thing in the world, Weaver, and knowing it is a cruel torment. I mean to bury the truths that I cannot endure at the heart of this tomb and be free of them forever." Weaver remained silent. After a while, Weaver spoke. "It seems to me that you already did, and you already are." With that, the Demon of Fate turned and walked away without looking back. Walking away, Weaver whispered, "You wanted to be free of the truth, so you didn't deserve it." Just like Weaver in the description, Sunny remained silent for a long time.
Wait, the tomb of Ariel is not the burial place of Ariel, the Demon of Dread? Instead, it's the tomb that he built?
That information alone was worth a lot. However, there was so much more in that strangely verbose description, like the fact that Ariel had constructed the Black Pyramid to hide ugly truths from existence, or rather, those truths that he could not bear to know. Wouldn't that mean that the clan or person to conquer the pyramid would learn all those secrets? But even more than that, Weaver's appearance in the description of the Mirror of Truth was itself very interesting. Sunny remembered the exact words.
"I have not known that you built a tomb, nor have I ever seen it. How would I know to admire it? I just happened to be here by chance. Now that I've seen it, my heart is untouched. I feel nothing."
Since Weaver had just been called the Master of Lies in the previous string of runes, wouldn't it mean that Sunny should take these words with a grain of salt? So the Demon of Fate had known of the existence of the tomb, had seen it before, had come to look at it again on purpose, and felt a great deal of things as a result. Maybe. Sunny thought about it for a while, then shook his head.
"I'll probably only know if I look at it myself."
With that, he shifted his gaze and glanced at the runes describing the enchantments of the Mirror of Truth. Or rather, an enchantment. There was only one. By now, Sunny knew that more powerful enchantments demanded more space within the weave. This meant that for a memory of the 7th tier to possess a single enchantment, that enchantment had to be a really powerful one. He read the runes.
Memory enchantments. Searching reflection. Enchantment description. Catch the visage of a being in the Mirror of Truth. Activate the enchantment to destroy the mirror and gain 1 power of the reflected being for a period that depends on its potency.
Sunny blinked a couple of times.
What?
His hand trembled. Wouldn't that make him a discount Mordret?
What the hell?
He stared at the mirror, not knowing how to feel. On one hand, being able to steal the ability of any being, be it a human or a nightmare creature, was crazy. On the other hand, the Mirror of Truth would be destroyed in the process, and the stolen ability would only persist for some time, which was still incredible. But the damned Prince of Nothing could do it any time he wanted, for as much time as he needed. Sonny shook his head.
No, this is an amazing memory. It's just that Mordred is seriously broken. And he even seems to be immortal to boot. Where's the justice in that?
Grimacing, he left the Soul Sea and opened his eyes, staring silently at the roof of the tent. His mood was not great. It did not remain foul for a while, though. That was because, after a few minutes of sulking, Sonny couldn't help but start thinking about whose ability he could steal. Nephis had outstanding abilities, except for her Ascended one, which was rather strange and all but useless. Cassia had great ones too. But why settle for those? What about Whispering Blade and Beastmaster? The transformation ability of a saint in his hands would be a fun trump card to have. Hell, he did not even have to limit himself to saints. There was a corrupted titan somewhere in East Antarctica. There was the Winter Beast, too. Sonny did not notice as a smile appeared on his face, and so he fell asleep, smiling. His last thought was,
Not bad for a day's work.